And I kind of appreciate the way you're pulling on different traditions of understanding and that ontological question of ways of living, right? And ways of being. You suggest that to be Muslim and anarchist is to refuse binaries. How is contradiction navigated? How is this contradiction navigated? And has the current war transformed that relationship?
I think the most fundamental way is the way that, and I mean, I've been ostracized within anarchist communities for being Muslim and vice versa from Muslim communities because I identify as anarchistic. Anarchism to me reminds me of what Islam should be. And I think there are a lot of dimensions that Islam and Muslims can teach anarchists or leftist movements in generally too. But like I said, this is a political theological project and one that needs to be anchored in a particular framing. And humility. A Taghuti mentality is coming about, or an anarchist, and it's understandable. Right? A lot of anarchists, particularly in Europe, America, who are white, they come from Orthodox Christian backgrounds, generally speaking. They've been exposed to hierarchical understandings of religion, repressive understandings, institutionalized understandings, sexist, misogynist, all kinds of understandings of religion, just as much as Muslims in predominantly Muslim societies are exposed to hierarchical interpretations of Islam, be it at Al-Azhar University or the state kind of Islam. Being able to re-envision Islam in a different way or any tradition in a different way, including for the white anarchist, becomes something that's very vital and important, right? And hence breaking out of the no gods, no masters kind of logic. A funny story I often tell in 2011, because religious anarchisms we have several books on religious anarchisms that emerged really 2011 onwards, 2010, 2011. But I remember being at an anarchist conference, anarchist studies network conference in Loughborough in 2011. And during the conference, I was giving a talk on Islam and anarchism, and I'm not going to say his name. Then this anarchist comes in, he's also an academic, or he is an academic, and he comes and after my talk, he's like, I want to ask you a question. I was like, sure, go ahead. He's a classical anarchist, right? And of course, there are many interpretations of anarchism just as much as there are many interpretations of Islam. But anyways, he comes to me and he says, so last week, we made effigies of the Prophet Muhammad, of Moses, of Jesus, and we burnt them. I just want to know what your thoughts are. I was like, well, here I am trying to bridge the proximity between, our disparate communities. And you come and tell me you made an image of, first of all, I don't know what my prophet looks like because we have no illustration of that. But sure, do what you may. But I want to ask you a question. Like, I'm trying to bridge the proximities here and you're trying to break them. You're trying to break the bridges. But if I was to say to you, I made effigies of Emma Goldman, Bakun, and Kropotkin, how would that make you feel? He's like, well, you can't do that. These are our gods. I was like, well, so much for no gods, no masters. So look, this is what I mean by the Taghut, that you construct a god, you construct prophets as God. And of course, I would never do that to Emma Bakun and Kropotkin. And I do have critiques of them. And again, this is where self-critique becomes important. A lot of them were Jewish anarchists, and they didn't really contend with the element of spirituality. But we grow or evolve. This is, the beauty about Malcolm is his endless metamorphosis, right? And any revolutionary has to be that way. You have to grow, and you have to grow in an interdisciplinary way. How do I connect with indigenous struggles? How do I connect with Maya traditions? How do I connect? Like one of the things that I learned is very early on when I moved to Turtle Island is smudging, right? And in Islam, you have tayammum. Well, when you don't have water to perform ablution, you just take some dirt, as you know, and you rub it across your hands and then your face, and you're a state of purity and you can pray. Well, smudging is more or less the same thing, right? It's meant to, you're burning some sage and it's this entering into a spiritual realm, a cleansiness realm, and so on. So it's the extrapolations and establishing booms between our various different traditions that become very important here, right? As opposed to embracing ourselves in closed boxes and closed identities and dogmatism and hegemonic vanguardist ways that really embody, again, a Taghuti, a Daeshi, a fundamentalist perspective. So I think, there's a lot that we can learn from one another. And again, we created you from different tribes and nations who make it to know one another.
Yeah, I think that especially anarchism in the US, like it emerged under certain conditions, related to like deindustrialization and those sort of things. Like I totally agree with what you're saying. I think a lot of these spaces can be exclusionary, while there are also a lot of interesting questions that they're answering in terms of the broader radical movement and those things. And the spaces can be exclusionary, but I also do see a greater openness to various forms of spirituality, in different ways.
More than Marxism, I have to give it to anarchists, I have to give it to
Yeah.
anarchists. It's much more than within Marxist spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like democratic socialist or left spaces over there, there's a great infatuation with the state, right?
Right.
And saving capitalism somehow, which I think is counterproductive as well. But I think that's kind of what we've seen because of the centrality of Palestinian solidarity, the role of MSAs and SJPs. I think like the growing coalition between them and like various like uh radical black Marxists, anarchists slash other groups. I think that has been a key. They've been very crucial in sort of decentering the larger hegemony of these groups that they had in the 90s and early 2000s and onwards. But obviously, I totally agree with what you're talking about there. In your book and in the Al Jazeera piece, you offer a critique of Muslim immigrants in North America for their complicity in settler colonial structures. This is something you mentioned earlier in the interview. What would a genuine decolonial Islamic solidarity look like across North America, Palestine, and beyond?
Thank you. Well, the embodiment of an Islam that is genuinely abolitionist, that contends with, as I noted earlier, anti-blackness, anti-indigenous politics, queerphobia, sexism, ageism, classism. In Turtle Island, relations with land. Look, even indigenous people have been displaced from land. We all need to relearn our relationships to land. There is no going back to 1492. So we need to get to know land in various different ways and geographies. As I noted earlier, there's a potential for an urban zapatismo, through guerrilla gardening or other tactics. But the irony about living in the US or Canada is most people of color live in the urban metropolis, right? So we've bought into civilizational modality, the high-rise buildings, the architectures, the jobs, university or otherwise. But who controls the land along the Rice Belt I-4 corridor, let alone in middle America, so to speak? It's the white farmers who are armed to the teeth with stamp decrees, and they're the ones that feed the urban metropolis. So they can end us all if they wanted to, be it vis-a-vis food access or access to food, or through physical violence. We need to rebuild our relationships with land, and we need to center indigenous people, as I noted earlier, at the very heart of the struggle. We need to go back to 1492. But this also needs to be embodied over here. For instance, insofar as Nubian people, they've been displaced 3-4 times, twice during the time of Nasser, I believe, once during Sadat and Mubarak's era as well. So if we're talking about tunnels, if we're talking about rebuilding our relationships, that means you're talking about 80% of Egypt is just desert. We need to move, and we need to start leaving the urban metropolis and building on farms and building relationships with people on the land, indigenous people, Siwa, for instance, Bedouin Arab tribes, and so on and so forth, right? The way that the Rafah border used to embody that kind of anarchistic sort of fluidity where the state didn't have control, Zionists didn't have control, but it was, these anarchistic sort of Bedouin communes, if you will, 100 people living in townships. I mean, they still exist, say, on the border of Egypt and Sudan at this moment, right? But exploiting that even further and building more of those and tying those together like a spider's web, like a network, right? You produce something that I have, like mangoes, I need apples. Okay, let's exchange in mutual aid and engagement. And what are you building your commune on? What am I building? But again, this can only be translated face to face. It can't manifest in the virtual sphere. It's not enough to simply say, oh, indigenous and black and Palestinian people, it's the same struggle. It's all one. What is the narrative, and how do we embody that in our day-to-day lives? That's, again, the practical question. But you still have to come up with the interpretation of the Quran that is decolonial, that is abolition. Everybody needs to go back to their tradition and develop from their perspective, in Islam or Christianity and Judaism or whatever of the below. Because any community is capable of rising to the above. Look at Maya civilizations, right? When the Aztec rose and became oppressive in a certain sense. They oppressed other indigenous people and communities and so on. So any civilization, any people, any spiritual compass can be easily contorted. That's not the fault of this spirituality or the religion or the faith within itself. It's the fault of the people that are doing the misinterpreting and misunderstanding. But I think, yeah, maybe everybody getting off Twitter and Facebook and gathering and pooling their wealth together or whatever, $100 from here, $100 from there, instead of all that money going to bailing kids that are, again, I'm not against taking over Grand Central Station, but how many people need to be arrested? How many times do you have to repeat the same time? That's a tactic. That's not a strategy. So why don't you pool all that money, those resources, buy a piece of land, put it in a land trust, and start building with indigenous people wherever you are, be it on linear Lenape territory or otherwise. That would be, lonely people. If you're in the case of, San Francisco, it's that kind of dedication, right? And growing food is not easy, but dirt cleans off a lot easier that city smog and blood and so on. So, but yeah, and living together is not, again, easy either. It's very challenging because if you imagine a couple, they will disagree on the height or like household chores, or unwashed dishes. Can you imagine what it takes to establish a community, right? If just a couple disagree and they a few years or they leave each other apart in a few years because they have these kinds of disagreements. Living with people is not easy, but it requires transparency, openness, humility, and a desire to grow and to learn and to contend the monsters that exist within us. This is what's critical.
You discuss about habitual solidarity, which is rooted in usul al-dafiyyah and usul al-ikhtilaf. What do these principles offer to contemporary leftists and spiritual movements seeking unity without flattening difference?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, or and just now, if we are to get to know one another, then the ethics of hospitality, disagreements, as opposed to Marxist tearing anarchists apart and anarchists tearing Marxists and everybody tearing feminists and everybody tearing spiritual people.
Internal parties.
Exactly, right? It's a one-upping of one another. And disagreements, as I've written, tend to happen for 4 different reasons, maybe more, right? One of them is ego. One of them is a lack of knowledge, lack of experience, a desire to triumph over another person with a different idea. And there are ways to deal with that, right? But because there is an ethics to disagree, whereby we can find middle solutions, whether it's something as a strategy or tactic, matters a lot. People tend to conflate strategies with tactic. They're not one and the same thing. Tactic is parachute gliders. A strategy is October 7th in its totality, and all the studies that entails, including surveilling sort of the enemy and everything, down to the surveillance cameras, let alone the height of the sidewalk or the siege barrier and how you're going to break through it, right? And something that evolves over time as well. So one has to have mediators in order to prevent shikak, because disagreements doesn't have to lead to us splintering apart. But the problem is that we don't have a consensus of what we're fighting against or what we're fighting for. If you tell me we're fighting against capitalism and imperialism and colonialism and we're on turtle line, I was like, okay, well, what about settler colonialism? Are we fighting about that against that too? Are we fighting against the state too? Or is this just because that will make an influence. If you believe that you can just take over the United States, then sorry, we can have tactical alliances, but we're not on the same strategic page because we're actually starting from different starting points. You see that it's possible to engage in some revolution through the state. I don't believe that that's possible at all. I think that that's a pipe dream fantasy, right? So, and usul al-dafiyyah becomes central then because we need to get to know one another across the prejudices that we've internalized. So that's what I mean. There are rituals of hospitality, right? In Islam, when you have a guest, you honor them for 3 days and a night. You don't even ask them what their name is because they could be escaping persecution. As Derrida would say, the name is to be offered unconditionally, without reservation, without fear. And even asking somebody's name could be a violent act, right? But you treat them or they are treated as if that's their home. The guest becomes the host. You give them the best of what you have. You give them your room. You give them, you don't just get them to stay on a couch. You offer them everything. So there's an ethics, and it varies according to cultures in terms of hospitality. Tupinamba tribal ceremonies, when a stranger comes to Tupinamba people, they cry because a guest is a guest from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're a guest from creation. They're a guest from the universe. And it's a miracle getting to know somebody's name, let alone taking responsibility for that name. I may die today, tomorrow, in a moment, an hour from now. And then it's left for you to bear responsibility for knowing my name. And all we leave behind, according to Islam, are three things. Knowledge that benefits future generations, children that remember us alongside with family, community, or a hospital, school, a tree that we planted that a poor person rests underneath in the blazing sun on a hot day, let alone eats from the dates, if that is a palm tree. So that's all that we leave behind. We don't take our books, we don't take our accolades, we don't take our certificates or degrees or our PhDs. We leave everything. Right. So again, back to that moment of humility. If we're getting to know one another, we need to invest in knowing each other's traditions, especially in this time. I mean, right now, and probably like 3-4 weeks ago, Ted Cruz put out I believe they're going to be discussing it in Congress or the Senate, the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, in Trump's last term in office, his first trip was also, as you probably remember, was to Saudi Arabia. And it was, I believe, in 2016. And he also got billions of dollars then, I think $500 billion, as a matter of fact. And Sisi was there, and it was this dystopian moment. And the request that Arabs had of him, particularly the Gulf Arabs, was, we want you to destroy the Muslim Brotherhood. We've destroyed them over here because, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood were removed in the context of Egypt and so on and so forth. But we want you to destroy them over there. What they meant by that is every single Muslim student association. They meant CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, ISNA, Islamic North Society of North America. All that have also bought into a world of the above, because they buy into a hyphenated American, unapologetic Muslim American identity. There are lots of those folks, right? And they're all founded on Muslim Brotherhood thought. Now, Muslim Brotherhood thought varies, and one MSA may be different than the other. One could be relatively liberal progressive, the other one more radical, the other one conservative, absolutely. But it is destroying any manifestation of so-called political Islam, any leftist potential alliance too, between these two factions. And Palestine is a perfect anchor for these two to come together, for this confluence of power to come together. But yeah, there's a lot of work to do, as we've clearly noted. In the meanwhile, to overcome these stereotypes, and ethics of disagreement and hospitality are fundamental.
So I want to conclude. I know that you've been through a lot over the last year or two. And what are your plans in terms of your work and just, moving forward? What are you exploring intellectually? How are you grounding yourself spiritually and politically? And what has been your approach to dealing with what you've been through?
Thank you. God bless you. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, like I said, it's not even what one gave, it's the right thing to do. And it's not even a sacrifice. It's an iota of what one should be doing in this great moment. Right now, of course, as you noted, I have the Substack, and I'm really enjoying the fact that I'm able to write freely there without having to have any gatekeeping whatsoever. I mean, there's always going to be gatekeeping, whether people circulate things or not. That's a different one. That's always part of the gatekeeping. But in terms of editors or publishing something with the various different platforms that exist there, right? So I'm free to write and say what I do. I'm unshackled from academia. I'm inshallah planning on teaching courses online. They're part of me and what a community of dearest friends are going to be referring to as the Resistance Academy. I've already planned out 5 or 6 courses. One course is on 1492. Another one will be 1492, Palestine and Turtle Island, and everything that we've been discussing and that I work on. Another one will be on gender and sexuality, connecting queer and feminist, indigenous, Black, Muslim traditions, people of color traditions with one another. A third course is on social movement histories. I think there is a huge gap between my generation and Generation Z in terms of understanding the decade of Seattle 1999 up until Tahrir and what has been built, the arc then, sadly, which I think has influenced a lot of the limitations in terms of horizons, because I think most people don't actually know social movement theories nor histories, especially that decade. That was really crucial, because that decade, a lot of movements took an anarchistic turn. And I'm seeing a return back to Lenin and Stalin, and which is really quite sad and ironic, as if these characters and figures were highly problematic. Right, and that history isn't fraught. But another course I'll be teaching is on the maqam. What are the weapons that Hamas or that al-Qassam versus Ansarullah are using. How did they create them? So really a study of the art of war, the guerrilla warfare, and counterinsurgency manuals, which is very important because we are, like I said,
No,
right
this
over.
is all very necessary work.
So yeah, there's that. It's going to be a part of the Resistance Academy. I didn't share this publicly yet, so this would be a first for you. I actually just finished a children's book called Heroes of the Ummah, because I believe this
Oh
new
wow.
generation needs to learn about the general Daif, Nasrallah, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. Yeah, and there are side characters within it. So inshallah, I think we'll have to independently publish it, but that's okay. But yeah, hopefully people will appreciate it, and particularly our children
Yeah.
who grew up with October but don't have an understanding of what happened. Children in Palestine, infants that have been murdered while they were 0 years old, while they're still unborn, and still within their mother's wombs. So yeah, I'm really grateful for opportunities like
This is
you, for
this is
opportunity friends that I have. That you've been keeping me in Ramadan was such a blessing to go through that. So my next piece is on Muhammad al-Daif, inshallah. Hopefully it'll be published soon. So yeah, it's been just trying to keep it very rich, and I do miss organizing on the ground, and I'm still trying to figure that out given the context of Egypt, which is very difficult.
yeah, this is really inspiring because the space for critical and radical, has been suffocated a lot, over a period of time. And I think, what you're doing is at the cutting edge, creating platforms which are independent and which allow you to do your work. And I think, for me, that is what's really inspiring. It's, sending you lots of love and solidarity and salams. Inshallah. Again, thank you, Dr. Abdou, for this radical, deeply grounded conversation. From the tunnels of Gaza to the pages of your books, you've shown that resistance is not tactical. It is not only tactical, it is strategic, theological, ethical, and intimate. To our listeners, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Support our work at buymeacoffee.com/OrganicFilamentsNetwork and stay tuned for more conversations at the intersections of faith, struggle, and refusal. Thank you again.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you to the audience. And God bless you for the work that you do. It's very admirable, and I'm very grateful for
Oh,
this
thank you.
opportunity.